The story of two pipelines that are located in the open waters of the Great Lakes, known as Line 5. And I'll just say a couple of quick words. I am an environmental lawyer. I have had over 20 years of experience both in private practice. I worked internationally working for USAID in Southeast Asia, and I ended up coming back to the nonprofit sector because it's really where you can focus your passion. And I can't think of anything more important for me personally to do than to think about the long-term stewardship and protection of the Great Lakes. And that's what's led me to be part of For Love of Water for the last 8+ years. This story about the Great Lakes and Line 5 is really kind of at the heart of the work that we do at Flow. And I'll get into that in the story, but I want to just give you an overview of where we're going to go tonight. So I want to just orient you and talk about the awakening in Michigan to really understand that it was just only a decade ago. There was a real understanding among citizens, among tribes, among state leaders about the energy future and the problems with oil transport, particularly in our pipelines, which are arguably the safest mode of transport. Then we'll be talking about Line 5. We'll be talking about the public trust duty of the state of Michigan and the multiple violations of this pipeline being located in these public trust waters. We're going to focus on a number of the risk factors that compel the shutdown of this pipeline, examine the alternatives to Line 5, look at the climate change risks. We're also going to look at the Enbridge's proposal of a tunnel and the regulatory approvals and permitting proceedings, as well as the litigation. And finally, and most importantly, about what you can do. 10 years ago, this past July, Line 6B ruptured, and it took over 17 hours for Enbridge to respond from their center in Calgary, Canada. And over almost 1 million gallons of heavy tar sands spilled and destroyed over a 40-mile stretch of the Kalamazoo River, originally coming from the Talmadge Creek. Wildlife, habitat destruction, and here are pictures of the aftermath. Homes, family, generational properties absolutely destroyed. And the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, when they put together their final report, they took a real deep dive because this had occurred just a couple months after the BP Horizon spill in April of 2010. And so this really wasn't on the radar for most people in America, but Michiganders really understood the magnitude of this disaster. And the NTSB talked about the pervasive culture of negligence within Enbridge, and talked about them being keystone cops. If you look at the I think you can see my cursor. Line 6B and the rupture happened here on Line 6B. The reason I want to show you this map, because it's very important to understand, of course, that Enbridge's network of pipelines is part of the Lakehead pipeline system, which include, it's 1,000 miles from Alberta, bringing down tar sands, and then it comes through Minnesota into Wisconsin in Superior. And so Line 5, of course, is this 45-mile pipeline that spans across the upper part of Wisconsin, the entire stretch of the UP, essentially, and then across the shortest span that they could build this pipeline in 1953. And that was in the open waters of this 5-mile stretch across the Straits of Mackinac that connects Lake Michigan to Lake Huron, and then down northern lower Michigan, and then across the St. Clair River. Line 5 originally was designed to transport 120 barrels per day. And now, because of pumping stations and anti-friction liquids, the pipeline now transports 540,000 barrels per day, or 23 million gallons a day. Or another way to think about it is every hour, 1 million gallons of oil goes through the heart of the Great Lakes. The difference, though, between Line 5 and Line 6B, where the disaster was, is that Line 6B carried the heavy diluted dilbit, whereas Line 5 carries refined dilbit, because it's refined here in Superior. And then, so about 80% of the load is, this kind of light sweet crude, and then 20% are natural gas liquids. So this is a view from the north side looking down. This is, if you're from the UP, you call all those folks down there the trolls, right? But this is an important visual. Line 5 is, a 30-inch pipeline on land. Once it hits the waters, however, it splits into two pipelines that are 20-inch in diameter. And again, they're located in the open waters of the Great Lakes, which go about 250 feet below the surface. What is particularly notable about Line 5 is that these pipelines could not have been built but for the express authorization that the state of Michigan granted to Enbridge back in 1953 through what's known as a public trust easement. And the public trust law is incredibly important to understand because it is part of our statehood. And it is really kind of the DNA of who we are as a state. The state of Michigan in 1837 took title to all the navigable waters in Michigan and also in the Great Lakes. And the state of Michigan has a perpetual duty to protect those paramount interests over private interests when they threaten to impair, harm, or pollute the resource. And as an organization, Flow is, our mission is to protect these public waters. And we are always coming at all of the different threats that we're looking at through this public trust lens. What's really important to understand is that not only does the state of Michigan have this perpetual duty, but as citizens, we are the beneficiaries of the public trust, meaning that we have a duty to hold our state leaders accountable when they fail to uphold the law. It is the gift that you have as citizens here in Michigan, and all of the states in the United States are public trustees. In about 2012, Beth Wallace and Jeff Alexander from National Wildlife Federation authored this really seminal report, Sunken Hazard, identifying Line 5 as just a huge threat to the Great Lakes. And this image of the diver, this was the kind of first footage that many people ever even saw of this pipeline. It was really out of sight, out of mind. And over the years, there have just been an incredible growing number of businesses and nonprofits and tribes and municipalities and counties and cities all over the state of Michigan who have learned about the threat that Line 5 presents, and then, of course, have opposed Line 5. And, remember, this issue really was came out of obscurity and became a top election issue in the 2018 elections. And we'll talk about that as Attorney General Dana Nessel ran on a platform to shut down Line 5, as well as Governor Whitmer. We're still in the early years in like 2013, 2014 here. over the years, as a public trust law and policy center, we have focused examining all of the multiple easement violations of Enbridge and have urged, we urged the Snyder administration and their task force and their advisory councils to enforce the law and to revoke the easement that allows the conditional use to occupy the Straits of Mackinac. And these are a number of the violations of, being reasonably prudent person. The 1953 easement, this will make you all laugh, only has an indemnity provision for $1 million. In light of the disaster in Kalamazoo, which was a $1.2 billion disaster, obviously this is inadequate. What I will just say, rather than just read all of these to you, we're going to visit this issue about the maximum unsupported span provision, because this really is the Achilles heel for this engineering infrastructure. There are grave concerns about the lack of, the ability to clean up an oil spill. I think it's really important, as students to think about is, as humans, we're not very good at making sense of temporal and spatial challenges. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the history of line 5 compared to line 6B, it's ironic because both of the pipelines have spilled more than 1 million gallons of oil into Michigan's air, water, and land. And yet the public really has not understood the magnitude of harm from line 5. Enbridge continues to say in the media that line 5 has never ruptured. That, and they're only talking about the portion in the Straits of Mackinac, but remember, all across the pipeline, there have been over at least 33 spills. The other thing I just want to mention is this notion of risk. Humans are not that great at assessing risk. I think this global pandemic is really illustrative of that fact. Risk is an equation of harm or consequences, time, the likelihood or probability of an event happening. And in the instance of line 5, because the magnitude of harm is so great with respect to a catastrophic oil spill, the risk becomes unacceptable. And I just want you to think about that, as you're reading materials, because, from Enbridge's perspective, they say, oh, well, the harm doesn't matter because the probability is so low. We'll see that the probability is actually much higher than they have argued in the past. Over the years, in 2014, the University of Michigan, Dr. David Schwab, first identified that the Straits of Mackinac would be the worst possible place for an oil spill. 2 years later, he and his colleagues did over 840 simulations to conclude that over 700 miles of shoreline could be at risk from a line 5 spill, using the 1 million gallon example from line 6B as a realistic possibility. And of course, there have been a number of studies looking at the essential inability of the U.S. Coast Guard and then the EPA to be able to respond to a spill. Just remember, over the past almost 10 years, we've had a number of years where we've had, 6 to 8 feet of ice in the wintertime, making an oil response plan almost impossible. Some of the other work that we have contributed to speak to lawmakers and to the public in the language of economics. If there were a spill of this catastrophic magnitude, what kind of costs are we looking at? We hired professors from Michigan State University to look at natural resource damage, to look at the tourism impacts, to look at property damage, drinking water supplies that would be destroyed, as well as fishing. And their numbers over a 5-year period, place a disaster on the magnitude of a $6.3 billion disaster. And that doesn't even talk about the potential for stopping shipping in the Great Lakes, which of course is a huge part of the economic engine for this region, and could really leave things, to a standstill. The alternatives to Line 5 in the case of decommissioning present, there are a number of them. And, as you think about problem solving, something, as big as decommissioning a pipeline, which we have tried to find an example, but we've never seen an example in the United States where the federal government, which regulates the safety and maintenance of lines, they have never done that. Because of this unique location on the public trust bottomlands, the state of Michigan has this extraordinary role in actually revoking the easement and looking for the necessary alternatives. Over the years, Flow and many other groups, including independent studies from London Economic International, as well as the UP Energy Task Force under Governor Whitmer now, have looked at a number of issues. Number one, because Line 5 carries natural gas liquids, it does supply propane, which is pulled out in Rapid River and then put into a depropanizer. Now, only 18% of the population in the UP relies on propane, but there are lots of other options, either trucking from Superior or Kinchinalo to the different homes and residents and businesses. And remember, that's not much of a stretch of what happens right now, because from Rapid River, the propane is still trucked out. There are other rail options to examine. And without Line 5, the economics are not out of reach. It's, we're talking about a 5-cent gallon difference. Similarly, if the Line 5 were shut down and decommissioned, gas prices in the state would likely rise like 2 cents a gallon. And, as you've gone to the pump, you've seen how the price fluctuations go up, 20 cents sometimes. And then the third piece is figuring out what happens to northern lower Michigan oil that is put into Line 5 and transported to refineries in Detroit and Toledo. Well, the good news is that it only represents about 1.5% of that total volume. There could be, combination of rail and truck and other modes like that. Line 5 could potentially just work in the lower northern Michigan as well. I want to talk to you more about the clear and present danger that this pipeline presents every single day in the open waters of the Great Lakes. Originally, when the Bechtel engineers designed this pipeline in 1953, they did a lot of important engineering analyses, however, underestimated the power of the currents. And they assumed that the lake bed floor itself would provide the structural support for this infrastructure. But the problem is that over 67 years, there have been extreme, because remember, these currents are just incredibly powerful. I don't know if you've been up the Straits. It is a wild environment, absolutely beautiful. And as you can see, early on, Enbridge was very concerned because the pipeline started moving about. It was exceeding the 75-foot requirement under the easement. Grout bags were placed, in the open waters and clay pillars. And in 2001, the situation became so serious that Enbridge engineers wrote a letter to the DEQ at the time, now named Eagle, and they said, look, this is an emergency. And they started with this new engineering design, which is this anchor saddle solution there. So I'm just going to go back to this last. So in the upper left, you can see this is what that anchor saddle looks like. So initially, they said, oh, well, this is just a minor repair and it's just a little maintenance. Since 2001, there have been over 228 anchor supports that have been installed on the lake bed. And remember, this new structure is lifting the pipeline off the lake bed floor over crevasses and these valleys from former riverine geological formations. It is creating greater, there are these extremely strong currents. The problem with these anchor structures is that they also are moving so much with the current that they are causing tremendous coating loss, which compromises the cathodic protection of the pipeline itself. This became a huge issue under the Snyder administration. Enbridge really lost its credibility, withholding information, not telling the government that their engineering design had this fatal flaw. And we started finding, dinner plate size scoured areas on the pipeline. Enbridge had known about this for years and did not inform either the state or the federal authorities. Looking in the whole totality, just kind of giving you a really brief overview, the public has never seen a risk analysis, a comprehensive engineering analysis of these 228 anchor supports. There's a citizens group called the Straits of Mackinac Alliance. They have been challenging the DEQ, now Eagle, on this issue about failing to look at the cumulative impact and requiring a new conveyance agreement under the Great Lakes Submerged Lands Act, which is our public trust law. As I mentioned, we've got this current-induced stress on elevated pipelines. And then here is something that is very alarming. Because these pipelines are now elevated off the lakebed floor, they are more prone to anchor strikes. And you can see here on the slide, this has happened at a pace that is extraordinary. Not only 1979, many of you weren't around. Most recently in April 2018, there was an anchor that struck one of the pipelines. And then just this past summer, the anchor support twisted and dented one of the pipelines. And in fact, it triggered a temporary court order under Judge Jamo. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. But we've got catenary events of these tugs potentially affecting the pipelines. And then let's not forget Enbridge's track record on safety, where we can see that there is a pattern of pipeline failures, 215 quote unquote incidences from 2002 to 2018, the other leaks that I've mentioned, and then continued fines, $6.7 million for neglecting these safety issues. These are not very big fines considering Enbridge profits likely $1 million or $2 million a day just on line 5. Most concerning, well, I shouldn't say most. One of the largest concerns we continue to have is the lack of financial assurances. In the agreements between the state of Michigan and Enbridge, Enbridge Inc., which is the parent company, has never been a signatory to any of those agreements. Enbridge has over 275 subsidiaries. And if there were a catastrophic spill in the billions of dollars, you can be assured that those subsidiaries will not have the kind of insurance to reimburse the state. So this is very, very troubling that we continue to allow this private company to operate in our public waters. At the same time, Enbridge had these very significant engineering problems where legislators, Republicans and Democrats alike, there was consensus that the continued operation of this vintage pipeline in our Great Lakes just cannot occur. However, Enbridge took advantage of the situation to work with the Snyder administration to broker really the sweetheart deal of the century. What resulted was Enbridge's proposed solution, this Great Lakes tunnel, where they would be able to use public land, not pay a dime for it, and they would build this, $500 million tunnel for their own use. They initially talked about it being a public utility. But since that announcement back in 2018, no company has come forward to say that they would be interested in being part of this tunnel. In fact, ATC actively said that they would not want to be part of it. At the 11th hour, during a lame duck session in 2018, Enbridge was able to work with the legislature to pass this tunnel law, that they amended the 1952 Mackinac Bridge Act to create a new public entity called the Mackinac Straits Corridor Authority. Very problematic for a number of constitutional reasons that I don't have time to get into. However, what it did, coupled with an agreement with the state, is that the Tunnel Act allowed Enbridge to build, relocate, and place their 5-mile stretch of the pipeline under the Great Lakes, and at the same time continue the operation of their pipeline, their current operations. This is an example of eating your cake, of having your cake and eating it too, because not many companies are able to pull this type of thing off. Of course, in building this tunnel that they professed to want to build, there are multiple, years are required in terms of the state approval, the federal approval. We have worked extensively with financial advisors who have looked at the SEC filings for Enbridge and looking at their projected capital costs. There are no intentions on those federally filed documents to say that Enbridge is planning to build this tunnel. Before I talk a little bit more about the tunnel, I also want to mention the litigation that has happened. This is a picture of Attorney General Dana Nessel. One of the first things that actually happened in 2019 under Governor Whitmer is Governor Whitmer directed Attorney General A.G. Nessel to examine the constitutionality of that Tunnel Act that we just discussed. And unfortunately, the state of Michigan did not appeal the ruling to the Supreme Court. But last June, and this is very significant, A.G. Nessel filed a lawsuit in Ingham County against Enbridge, revoking the 1953 easement based on this unacceptable risk and threat to public trust resources. And under Michigan law, we require, it's called the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, all state agencies are required to not only assess the potential harm to the public resources, but they're required to look at feasible and prudent alternatives. And as we discussed before, there are a number of key alternatives to transporting the oil that is predominantly coming from Canada, going back to Canada. One other quick thing I just want to mention is that the Bad River Band in Wisconsin, Line 5 goes through about 12 miles of the Bad River Band. The easements that allowed Enbridge to occupy these sovereign lands expired. And Bad River said, Enbridge, your time is up. They have been negotiating, and Enbridge actually offered them $24 million to allow this continued occupation. And the Bad River Band has said no. So that continues as well. I want to just wrap up, and I want to just talk a little bit more about the permitting process under EGLE and also the Michigan Public Service Commission. And right now we are in the process where Enbridge they have done an amazing job just diverting the public's opinion and attention away from the ongoing threat of the current operations by focusing on this tunnel project, which we don't know will ever happen. The first point that I want to make is that back in 2018, in that sweetheart deal that I described, the state of Michigan never applied public trust law to look at the harm to the resource and also the feasible and prudent alternatives. Those agreements are void on that basis. In addition, EGLE must apply the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, again, looking at feasible and prudent alternatives. looking at the greenhouse gas emissions that will affect everyone for the next 99 years if Line 5 continues to operate. Now, remember, this is only 5 miles of the 645-mile pipeline that would be replaced. And, the rest of this pipeline, therefore, would have to be also replaced. We are seeing a dramatic shift with oil markets. In April, it was negative $39 a barrel. It's extraordinary what is happening. The other issue, this pipeline project is at complete odds with the governor's recent executive carbon neutral order. Most recently, there was a discovery of archaeological ruins on the lakebed floor that would be potentially destroyed from the drilling of a pipeline underneath. Lots of other technical questions. Enbridge's design doesn't even seem complete. In the current submissions to the state, they're relying on this 2018 report, which said that the pipeline would be 10 inches. But now in the new application, they're saying it's going to be either 18 or 20. Lots of challenges with this tunnel boring machine. The geological information is incomplete. They haven't done sufficient borings through that entire 5-mile stretch, linking the peninsulas. There are tremendous water quality threats with a proposed 5 million gallons a day of wastewater from the drilling operations and slurry mix without an adequate wastewater treatment system. There are coastal wetlands that are of the highest pristine value, these benchmark coastal wetlands as they're referred to, that would be destroyed with 2+ years of construction of this tunnel. Of course, it also threatens fishing rights, cultural resources, and endangered species. This is a very interesting statistic that the Michigan Climate Action Network just pulled up, looking at this 2017 alternative analysis for the Straits Pipeline final report. And in fact, it turns out that decommissioning Line 5 would not only generate more jobs, but add more money into our economy than building the tunnel. The other piece of Enbridge's permitting is that Michigan Public Service Commission, the MPSC, must certify the siting of pipelines. And because this pipeline is under the lakebed floor in our public bottomlands, they also are subject to public trust law and MEPA. And here's the language of the law about examining whether there's no feasible and prudent alternative. Enbridge has never contemplated the option of having no pipeline. It's either the current pipeline or the tunnel, or the pipeline in the tunnel. And there has to be more options that are examined. In addition, the commission has to look at the financial risk and climate impacts. As many of you know, there is just so much at stake. There's a huge shift in the financial markets. With President-elect Biden, we will be, as a country, likely to join the Paris Climate Accords again, and really take a different shift than we have in the last couple years. But you can see, we've got bankruptcy and abandoning these major tar sands projects, which Enbridge pipelines fuel. And these are all the climate risks. I can just share these slides with you. Lastly, if you have a moment, go to our website and urge the governor to revoke the easement, because then the Department of Natural Resources that holds title to the public trust bottomlands can be part of the litigation with Dana Nessel. Here are examples of more fact sheets and on our website that you can look at. I love this quote from W.H. Auden about thousands have lived without love, not one without water. And that is really what is at stake here. This pipeline represents just a clear and present danger that must be addressed. And if I haven't expressed the urgency for action, I'll just state it again, because when you talk to the engineers and they understand that a 67-year-old pipeline is located in the middle of 20% of the fresh surface water on the planet, their eyes really light up.